Renaissance painters are able to depict these fabrics, these luxurious fabrics, so realistically that we really can identify them, right? We can identify satins and velvets and brocades and fine silks, and that is what helped influence the change in Renaissance fabric. So you want to be able to show the movement and the luxuriousness and the matching of the patterns in these garments. And in many of these prints, these fabrics copy, Chinese and Persian and Indian, patterns or motifs, which shows still the strong, close trading contact that Italy had with many of the countries in the East. So, we can see the luxuriousness of these Italian textiles, and we also can see that Italian textiles at this point are far superior than the textiles found throughout Europe. So, as we move through our other countries, we'll be making some references back to the use of Italian fabrics because they are going to be traded across countries. So let's look at what they wore, right? The image that we have on the screen actually shows men and women in Italy, both wearing Italian dresses. Actually, this image is from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and what they wear was pretty characteristic for this period, for the late 14th and early 15th century, when Gothic styles were still influencing dress. And what they're wearing, the men are wearing what is known as a doublet. It is a knee length, basically it's a tunic. It's just a modified version of a tunic. It's just called a doublet. And they also wear hose. And remember, hose were introduced in that medieval period we talked about last chapter. So they did wear hose, and they wore the doublet. And the doublet it could be either long or short. So if we look at the image at the bottom, almost at the bottom left, there are two people that have red hose and kind of knee length garments. Those are the shorter version of the doublet. And then the image, let me see, they're all monks. Everybody else is a monk, but they are wearing a longer version. But the doublets, they were either long or short, and they had wide, funnel-shaped, hanging sleeves, which that you see. Generally, men at this point kept their hair short. Women, on the other hand, had made some modifications to what they wore that was a drastic change, right? So um, the garments that the women are wearing in this image is called a hooplands, and they had imaginatively cut sleeves, right? So they had long, full sleeves. The sleeves were lined in a contrasting fabric, and the edges of the sleeves were finished and kind of dangling. So if you look at that image at the bottom left of the screen, that is probably the best representation of what the Huplands look like. And this is different, right? This is different. The decoration we have seen in every other period, that dress was simpler, right? So I mean, we did see some decoration in the upper classes when we talked about Rome and the Byzantine Empire, but it was everyday decorative dress. So what changed, right? Because we talked about the shift. What was the shift? There was a little bit of a little bit of a shift here. The length of the garments did vary. So like I said, the doublet they was worn either long or short, and sleeves in the body of your garment were generally one piece, and then there were uh, holes cut in, so openings cut in to have some movement. But Some of the other changes were garments, had a collarless neckline. Generally, a U shape was cut as an opening with a curve, so much different than the wrapping of garments that we've seen. Um, Hose, which were recently introduced, were used much differently than they were in the early in late medieval time. Sometimes they were cut as two separate pieces, so one for each leg. But sometimes they were actually sewn together, so more like the what you would think of as a lady's hose. But by the end of the century, fashionable at the end of this era, fashionable young men began to wear a doublet and a hose with in the hose without a jacket. So there is evidence though that that hose were actually woven fabric and cut on a bias. So um, more like what we would consider a legging, a little bit thicker. And oftentimes there was a lacing of the hose at the waist to help it, have a smooth fit. So, Renaissance painters, depict men in physical activity still, with their laces untied and their hose hanging loosely to the back. For women, we still see the chemise. They just put an Italian word on it, um, camicia, and it was just made of linen. And the quality of fabric really determined the status of the wearer. So again, a fuller cut was used with sheer fabrics, and a closer to the body cut was used with those heavier fabrics. And it was floor length. The sleeves were generally long. Sometimes they had a raglan style. Sometimes they were set into the armhole, and um, you know, it later in the century, the chemise, that undergarment, was displayed as the edging. It was displayed with edging at the neckline and really fine embroidery. So sometimes smocking was added or edging, and even though it was an undergarment, oftentimes the chemise is shown with peasant women wearing it as an outer garment, right? Because they were kind of in the privacy of their own little area, or inside of their homes. At the beginning of the century, necklines were generally high, and by mid-century they were usually rounded but still high. As we moved towards the end of the century, they tended to be lower but more square, um, and more often so with a deep V held together by lacing that showed off a little bit of the chemise. And when two layers of the dress was obvious, the underdresses were fitted quite fairly, so the chemise was fitted pretty closely um, to the body, but it would be visible at the neckline and the sleeves and at the arms. So the chemise still existed. It was still underneath all of these layers, but it did, as an undergarment, it had a practical application, but it was still included in the overall decorative interpretation of the garment. Styles in Italy in this era are differently marked from those of Northern Europe and of Britain. And that's in part because of, as I mentioned earlier, those design motifs that come from their trading partners, right? From their interaction with the East, and much more elaborate brocades and velvets and sumptuously decorated textiles were produced by Italian weavers, as well as items that were traded with those partners in the East. So, these garments developed at a time when a new spirit was developing in arts and literature and philosophy. Um, There were economic changes brought by powerful families. There was that social class structure where, even though the sumpter law is limited, right? Limited, but you could purchase, luxurious clothing and accessories, and materials are pretty much readily available in Italy through industry that really focus on the production of textiles, and a production of a variety of textiles. So, like I've said, wool, cotton, linen, silk, all of these were produced in Italy at the time. So the people in this era had a lot more to choose from. And I just really can't say enough about the those cross-cultural themes, right? Those cross-cultural themes, those foreign influences that came to dominate Italian city states and really just became a part of the culture of these city states. So, textile designs, which were produced in this Italian Renaissance, were famous, and they really just had a long lasting impact, not just on clothing at the time, but really clothing design for centuries, especially because we use many of these designs in home design for the area. So that's where we're going to finish off with Italy. And next, we're going to move in the next tab, the next set of lectures. We're going to move on to the rest of the European Renaissance. It's known as the Northern European Renaissance, even though it includes England in there too. So we'll talk a little bit about Germany, Spain, England, and how their Renaissance started a little bit later and what dominated their Renaissance period.